And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our feature presentation today. And for that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Katie Wallet, who is going to share with us for about the next 20 or 30 minutes about Medicaid appeals. So glad to have you with us. Thank you. And Katie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. As Bruce said, my name is Katie Wallet. I am the Interim Director of Administrative Advocacy here at CCLP. I use she, her pronouns. And we're so excited to present this webinar to you today that we are calling Your Guide to Medicaid Appeals. And I wanted to start by just making a quick note that most of our slides in this slide deck are in both Spanish and English. There are a few here at the beginning that are only in English. I am going to be saying aloud all of the information that's important on these slides. So with our Spanish interpretation, it's our hope that you will be able to follow along until we get to those slides that are bilingual. So before we get started, I did want to just give you a brief introduction into who we are, in case you don't know. We are the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, or CCLP. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization that works to advance the health and well-being of Coloradans facing economic insecurity. And we've been doing this work in our state for about 25 years. We have 4 focus areas. We focus on food and food access. We focus on housing, on income and income supports, and health and healthcare access. Though, of course, all 4 of these are so interconnected and interrelated. We generally use 4 different tools to advocate for all Coloradans, which you can see here in the corners. We use legislative advocacy, so you can see us in the Capitol during the legislative session. We use legal advocacy. We build coalitions working with many incredible community partners, some of whom are here today, so welcome. And we do research and policy analysis. So what are we doing here today? Here is the agenda. We are presenting an overview of 3 in-depth guides that we've created about the Medicaid appeals process. So we're going to give you, we're going to connect you to resources and knowledge and provide you with an overview of the appeals process so that you know what it is, why you might appeal, how to ask for an appeal, and what happens next. So you won't finish this webinar knowing every single thing you need to know to be ready to file an appeal, to request an appeal. But you will finish the webinar armed with knowledge and resources to provide to your clients and your community about this process, and more importantly, where to get more information. And as Bruce mentioned at the top, we are saving a good amount of time to answer your questions. So please feel free to go ahead and submit your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A function throughout this presentation. And we do have staff who will be monitoring those questions so that we can answer them at the end. And as you also undoubtedly know, our webinar is being recorded and will be posted online. So please don't worry if you miss anything I say or anything on the slides, as all of that will be available. So before we jump into the guides, I did just want to take a quick moment to talk a little bit about why we're doing this webinar now and why we're presenting these guides. And the real answer, right, is the pandemic and the end of the public health emergency. So as most of you probably know, during the pandemic, all Medicaid members received what was called continuous coverage. What that meant was that the state was not allowed to take anyone off of Medicaid during the last 3 years of the emergency. So that meant that Medicaid benefits were continued whether or not that particular individual remained eligible for Medicaid. But as we know, on May 11th, the Biden administration declared an end to that public health emergency. So now all states, including Colorado, will begin what they're calling the unwind process. So they'll be going through to determine who is still eligible for Medicaid and who's no longer eligible. The Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, which is our state agency that's responsible for Medicaid, is anticipating that at least 350,000 people will lose their Medicaid benefits over this next year, over the unwind process. And that means that a large number of people are going to begin to receive letters from Medicaid. And we really wanted to ensure that there are resources out there for them to navigate that process. And in fact, people have already begun to receive their renewal packets, and some people will begin to lose their benefits as early as the end of this month. There is a second reason that we're doing this webinar, and this is a reason that is true all of the time, whether it is a pandemic or not. We wanted to make these guides because your clients have rights. Medicaid is an entitlement program, and the department and Medicaid providers have responsibilities to you or your clients as Medicaid members. And we at CCLP really believe that the system is strengthened when people know and can exercise their rights. So that is why we are doing this now. So let's take a look at the guides. So to help community members, such as yourselves, really better understand these rights and how to access them, we created 3 guides as references for Medicaid members and their case managers in English and in Spanish. And what I'm showing you now is an image of our website and the guides that are posted there. So what we did is, with the help of a wonderful legal intern, along with multiple members of our staff, we did a deep dive and reviewed the regulations and all the laws that outline the appeals process for Medicaid. And we pulled that information together into 3 separate guides that use non-legal and accessible language to help Medicaid members, case managers, and other folks in this space know how to navigate this process. And in creating these guides, we also met with community members to talk to them and really understand what they needed to know about the appeals process. Oh, excuse me, going back to the English, sorry about that. There are 3 separate guides. The first is how and why to request an appeal. The second is all about getting ready for the hearing. And the third is all of the options after the hearing is completed. So one important point that I want to make now is that nothing in these guides is legal advice. These are just intended to help people understand the options that are available to them. So while I am a lawyer, I cannot provide you any legal advice today, and that's true even for questions you might ask at the end of the presentation. I just can't provide you any legal advice, but what I can do is provide you with information about this process. As we said, it's being recorded. It will be available for free on the website along with the guides that you can also download. So let's jump into the first guide. This is an image of the cover of this first guide, how and why to request an appeal. And we wanted to start this presentation by giving you a sense of what's included in this first guide, because it really provides an overview of the appeals process. So let's dive in. We are going to begin at the beginning. So your client or you have received a letter from Medicaid. You always have the right to be informed about decisions that are made about your Medicaid benefits in writing, generally in the form of a letter that you get in the mail. This letter is often called a notice or a notice letter, and I'm sure you'll hear me use those terms interchangeably today. These letters don't always look the same. There are different types of letters and they come from different places. And that really depends on what kind of Medicaid you or your clients receive, or what program or waiver you might be in. So our first guide provides a few examples of some of these letters from Medicaid because they can be difficult to understand. So here's a bigger image from that first guide that shows an example of a notice letter in detail. And there are specific requirements for each letter or notice from Medicaid that has to be included for the notice to be considered proper. And these requirements come from federal law. So I want to take a minute to just go through those quickly. These letters need to include the notice date. That's at the top left here. This is the date that Medicaid sent the letter. It also has to include the decision that's been made, right? The letter might tell your client that they do not qualify for Medicaid anymore. That's the decision. They also have to include the reason for that decision. For example, the letter might say, you are no longer eligible because your income is too high. In addition to that reason, the letter also has to provide the actual law or regulation or rule that the decision was based on. So there should be a citation in the letter that directs you to the exact legal rule that the decision was based. So going now to the second page of this in-depth notice letter, there are two other important points that have to be included here. One is the date of action. That is the date that the decision will be in place. So it's really important to note here that the date that this decision will be in place has to be at least 10 days after the date the letter was sent. And that makes sense, right? You can't get a letter from Medicaid that says, hey, you lost your Medicaid benefits last month. The date of action has to be in the future. And then the last piece to highlight here is that the notice has to include information on how you can request an appeal. And it specifically has to include the deadline by which you need to do that. So if you remember only one thing from this webinar, I want it to be that this notice letter, all of these letters that you receive, are legal documents. They have requirements that they must meet in order to be proper. And once you've received these letters, you have legal rights. If you receive a notice letter that does not include all of the things that we just discussed and that are listed in detail in the guide, you have a really good reason to request an appeal because Medicaid broke the rules. So the most important thing to remember here is you or your clients should always keep copies of these letters. They contain important information and you always need to have this to start the process. All right, so I've received a notice from Medicaid and I've been told I'm no longer eligible because my income is too high. What are my options? What can I do if I disagree with that decision? If I think my income does in fact qualify me, what can I do? There are basically four options, again, which are all listed in the guide. The first is you can request an appeal. We'll obviously talk more about that. The second is you can request an informal meeting with representatives from Medicaid or your home health agency to talk about the decision. Another option is in some cases you can reapply for Medicaid. If the letter says you're not eligible or you didn't provide the right information, you can reapply. And then the last option is, again, in some cases, you can send additional information. For example, maybe I have pay stubs that show my income has actually gone down and I now think I'm eligible. I could provide that information. So I want to be clear here. You can do more than one of these options at a time. Sometimes it really is best to both request that formal appeal and at the same time, ask for an informal meeting so that you can discuss your situation with the people who've made the decision while you are waiting for the hearing date to meet with the judge. And our first guide does provide some information on requesting that informal meeting, this second option here. But we're really focusing on the process of filing a request to appeal the decision. So what do we mean when we say request an appeal? What are we talking about here? An appeal is a legal word that means you disagree with a decision that affects you. So it's the same word that we use in legal cases in court when someone disagrees with the decision a judge has made. So I'm found liable for something, I disagree with that, I appeal that case, right? When you're requesting an appeal, you're sending paperwork to ask a judge to review the decision and hopefully make a different one. What you're doing is asking for a hearing, which we'll talk more about, to give you that opportunity to tell the judge why you think the decision you made wasn't the right one. And the first guide gives you information about how to file the appeal, as we said, but I want to remind you, as we mentioned, the notice letter you receive from Medicaid also is required to tell you information about how to request that appeal. So among the options, why might you consider an appeal? A formal request for an appeal is the only way to get a person outside of Medicaid, so someone who did not make the decision, to listen to your story. And you have the right to tell that story when you disagree with a decision that affects you and your benefits. These are some of your due process rights. Requesting an appeal is the only option to try and keep your Medicaid benefits going while you try to change the decision. So none of the other options we mentioned gives you the right to ask to continue your benefits while you wait for the process to finish. So that's a really important point. When you request an appeal, you have the right to receive more information from Medicaid about why they made the decision that they did. And finally, sending that request to appeal does not mean you cannot take other steps to work out the issue, right? So you can continue to speak with those that made the decision, your home health agency, your Medicaid representative, anytime during that appeal process to try and fix the issue. Here is a page from our first guide, and you're going to see this page a few times. This outlines the basic overview of the steps of what happens when you go through the appeals process. So almost always, it starts with a notice letter, as we discussed. After you receive that letter, you send in the request to appeal to the Office of Administrative Courts. We'll touch on this more in a minute. Third, you have a hearing with the judge at the Office of Administrative Courts. As we've said, there are times where you might resolve the issue before it goes to hearing. So not every time a client of yours files an appeal, requests an appeal, will you go to the red box to hearing, right? Some cases are resolved outside of that. But if you do have a hearing, you go down to the green box. After the hearing, the judge will make an initial decision in writing. This is not a final decision, it's an initial decision, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. So our first guide provides the specific information that you need to know how to request that appeal. How do you send in, excuse me, how do you send in or file the paperwork that you need to make that official request? It tells you what specific information needs to be included in that request, where to send the request, and when to send the request. There are strict deadlines that you don't want to miss when you are filing an appeal. And the guide does give you some information on what can you do if you do in fact miss one of those deadlines. And finally, the guide also provides information about what you need to do to keep your benefits going while you go through the appeals process. So that is our first guide. Back to the outline. Our first guide goes through how to read and understand your notice letters, what those letters must include to be proper, and then how to actually send in the request for an appeal. The second guide is all about this red box, the hearing itself. So, what do we mean when we say hearing? What is a hearing? The hearing is the formal meeting where you and representatives from Medicaid or the state agency have the opportunity to present information to the administrative law judge, who will ultimately make that initial decision in your case. It is a bit like a trial, but it is not nearly as formal. One of the clear differences here is there's no jury. It's just you, any witnesses you might bring, the state agency or the representatives of Medicaid or the home health agency, and any witnesses they might bring, telling your stories in front of the administrative law judge. As I've said, many appeals cases don't end up with a hearing because whatever has happened can be worked out separately. Because you can exchange that information while you're waiting for the hearing date, many cases are resolved before the hearing, just like many court cases don't end up going to trial. But to prepare you for that hearing, we've created this second guide. Our guide includes information on how to prepare for that hearing, who to talk to, and what information to gather beforehand, what to expect will happen at that hearing, and what will happen afterward when you receive that initial decision. I wanted to show one example of the specificity that this guide provides. Here is a page from that second guide. And this slide has a lot of words on it. You are not expected to read them all, and you don't need to because it is in the guide, right? But the guide goes through the very specific information that you need to be ready for this hearing, including this checklist. What should you do to prepare? How to be ready for an in-person hearing or an on-the-phone hearing? How to use witnesses to provide more information. So this is just an example of the level of specificity that we go into in presenting this information for everyone. I'm going to go to the next slide, and I know you have not read this, and that is okay, because they will always be available to you in this resource that we're providing. All right, back to the timeline. So the first guide, as we said, goes through the letters, how to request that appeal. Then comes the hearing. Second guide, red box. The end result of that hearing is a written decision, an initial decision by the administrative law judge. And the third guide starts here with the green box. The third guide is all about what happens after the hearing. What options do you have if you disagree with that initial decision? As we said, that initial decision is not a final decision. And going from the initial decision to the final decision is another step in this process. So here's an image from that third guide that outlines this piece here. After your hearing, the judge will make an initial decision, which you receive in writing. The case then moves from the Office of Administrative Courts and goes to the Office of Appeals, which is within the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing. So this is a separate body who's reviewing. Here, if you disagree with that initial decision, you have another opportunity to tell the judge that you disagree and to present some information about why. So this third guide tells you all of the steps that you would need to take in order to do that. And it also tells you what happens next, receiving that final decision from the Office of Appeals. The third guide also goes into what happens after you get that final decision if you disagree with it, how you can request an appeal of that final decision or ask for reconsideration. This third guide really focuses on everything that can happen after the hearing and the initial decision and what you can do in those circumstances. So again, all three of these guides are available in Spanish and in English to download on our website. And I've just put up the image here of what our website looks like. You can get here by going to cclponline.org and clicking resources here at the top right. If you click right here on this button, because we just made this site live yesterday, this page will be the top of that resource list. You can also find it here at the longer link at the bottom. This is the same place we'll be putting the recording of the webinar, and you should have received the link in your reminder email about this event yesterday. All right, with that, I'm going to stop and see what questions we have. I am going to leave this slide up, at least for a minute, which shows my email address. Again, I'm Katie Wallet, and underneath my email address is Milena Castaneda. She is our policy fellow, and she's another great person to reach out to if you have questions that aren't answered today. But for now, I will turn it back over to Bruce and see what questions we have coming in.
Thank you, Katie, for that wonderful and informative presentation. That was great. Really a tremendous amount of information. So I'm sure there's a few questions here. We've had a couple already come in through the course of the event, so I'll start with those. So we get to them first. But just a reminder, go ahead and put your questions directly into the chat. And one of our colleagues is capturing those for us. So we'll get to all your questions. And if you would like to, we also have the option, if you raise your hand in the participant pane of the webinar, one of our webinar hosts today can unmute you and you can actually ask your question live if you would like. So if you want to do that, you prefer not to type, just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get to you that way as well. So with that, Katie, I'm going to start with the first question we had today that we weren't able to answer in writing, which is, are only denial letters being sent?
So that's a good question. I assume that this question is really about this renewal process that's happening with the unwind. Yes, denial letters are sent. We know that the department has started to send some approval letters, which means if you have a specific benefit and your home health agency has requested a certain amount of hours, for example, for that benefit, that the department might send an approval notice saying you have been approved for this specific number of hours. I don't know the broader answer to the question in terms of, will you receive a notice that yes, in fact, you are continuing to receive benefits? But my understanding of the renewal process right now is that you will receive a renewal packet. And it's not going to be a packet dated May 11th, the end of the public health emergency, right? It will come to you during your renewal date, which could be any time over the next year. And you're responsible to fill out that packet. I really advise you to spend some time and know that you will have to spend some time to do so. Some of these packets are quite long. You need to sign the packet and then send it back in. And my understanding is that Medicaid is required to tell you if there's some piece of information that is missing and they can't process your account. So I'm not sure the answer to the question of, will I receive a letter that definitively states I am receiving benefits? But you should be receiving communication about your benefits going forward. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the next one that we have for you, Katie, is will the Medicaid benefits remain throughout all levels of the appeal process? So I think it's, if I can paraphrase that slightly, just, do the benefits that you have or are entitled to, do they continue during the appeals process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's, again, a really important reason for why you might file an appeal or have a client request an appeal. So the way it works is you have to file, which just means sending in the paperwork. to request that appeal within a certain deadline, which is a shorter deadline if you want to keep the benefits going during the appeals process. I don't have the exact day number, but it is in our guide, I can tell you that. So if you get that notice letter that says you don't have benefits or your benefits have been terminated, and you file and send in that paperwork to request that appeal within that short timeline, on that form, you check a box, you basically say, I want my benefits to continue. Your benefits should continue throughout the process, through the hearing, which sometimes is a month or two after you've requested it. They should continue past the hearing to the day you receive your initial decision. And then they should continue all the way until that final decision. Because that decision is termed final, is the decision that has been made through the Office of Appeals, that is when your benefits might actually turn off. The third guide that really goes through what your options are at that point, if you disagree with that final decision, my understanding is that your benefits will have terminated by that point, or whatever the decision is in the letter. If the final decision matches that decision, meaning you have in fact lost your benefits, at that point you would be without benefits. That doesn't mean there aren't still options for you to kind of tell someone why you disagree, but you would not have your benefits at that point.
Yeah, and this next one is a good segue, and I think you partially answered this, but just to clarify, so in that case, if a denial is upheld, is the member then responsible for reimbursing Medicaid for any of those services that were received during the appeals process?
That is a really great question. And there are some notice letters that have language about that. So there are some notice letters that say, if you request an appeal and you lose that appeal, you might owe Medicaid the money that you were given during that while you continued with your benefits. We've been told that in fact the state never does that, never asks people to pay even if they end up losing their appeal. I also know that for some of the letters going out, that language has been entirely removed. And I think that basically the state is no longer doing that. So that really shouldn't be an impediment for someone wanting to request an appeal.
Well, that's really good to know. Yeah. Okay, here's one I'm not sure you'll know the answer to, but how does Medicaid locate people who have moved recently?
That is a great question. There's been a huge effort as the state has been preparing, and all the states have been preparing for the end of this public health emergency. There's a big campaign that you probably are aware of. You can find lots of information about it via partner websites, but also from the department about updating your address. And so there's been this real push to try and help those folks who have moved or who have housing instability to ensure that PEAK and the Medicaid providers really know how to reach them. The answer to your question of what will happen if you don't receive it, right? If your address has changed or you're representing a client who is housing unstable, if they don't receive the documentation, they are at risk of losing their benefits. And that's why this campaign to sort of help folks really keep up with their information and contact information has been so major.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Katie. I'm seeing also we're capturing some comments that folks have made in the chat that weren't questions, but we are capturing those in our documentation here, so we'll have those for our wrap up after the event. All right. Well, I think we've gotten through all of the questions that I see posted right now, so I'm just going to give one more call. Does anybody want to post another question or pop up on raise your hand and pop up on audio and ask a question live? Oh, we got one more coming in here. Good. So as a case manager to the homeless, is it all right to forward or put addresses as in care of? So like an alternative address for somebody who doesn't have a permanent address presently.
I don't know the answer to that. My guess is yes. but I think I'm hearing yes. Okay, so I luckily have a team of people who are helping me. And I'm hearing from multiple folks from different organizations that yes, that is perfectly acceptable, and might be a great way to protect your client. So good idea.
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, it looks like several people are saying yes. So we've got the team is on it here. So another one here, I'm just seeing, does any of this information transfer over to those enrolled in emergency Medicaid?
I also don't know the answer to that question. I'm not quite sure I understand it.
Yeah, I'm not sure the information that's being referenced, but I think the question is mostly about sort of the difference between being enrolled in emergency Medicaid or regular Medicaid. And maybe the team can help us answer that one or clarify a little bit there as well.
I mean,
Okay.
certainly the rights that you have that are associated with being a Medicaid member apply whether you're on emergency Medicaid or not. But I'm not sure I totally understand the specific question.
Yeah, somebody can, if you ask that question, go ahead and if you'd like to clarify a little bit for us, that would be appreciated, or just raise your hand. We can have you pop up on audio if you want to talk about that a little bit more with us. That would be fantastic. Okay, so I've got kind of a long one here. Let me see if I can parse this. It's from Carrie. She said she'd like to clarify the differentiation between denial and termination, or your benefits are ending. A denial would refer to a new application for MA benefits that is not approved, whereas a termination means that the redetermination was not approved, or they were determined not eligible after an approval, and that maintenance of services continuation of benefits does not apply to a denial. I think that's more of a sort of a clarifying comment than a question, just about the terminology between denial and termination from Carrie there, looks like.
Yeah, I think that's right. The one thing I would just add is that a denial can refer to not a new application, right? So with the prior authorization requests, for example, with private duty nursing services, your home health agency can request a certain number of hours to be staffed by that type of nurse, right? And you can receive a denial of some or all of those hours. And so you're still eligible for Medicaid, you're still receiving Medicaid services, but you might get a denial about a specific service. And in those cases, if you were to file an appeal, you would maintain the level of services that you were receiving before you got that denial until the end of the appeals process. But that's a really helpful reminder. As I said, I'm an attorney, but I don't know all the ins and outs and all the specific words. So I really appreciate that sort of help in clarifying those words. Oh, Bruce, I did actually see another question.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is what to do if the appeal is denied, and also asking about the percentage of favorable appeals.
Yes.
That's a great question. What to do if your appeal is denied? Well, the first thing to do is go to our website and find guide number 3, right? So if you when you request your appeal, you'll get an initial decision. If that initial decision says, no, we agree with Medicaid, right? Then there's that second process where the initial decision goes to become a final decision. And that is outlined a lot in the 3rd guide. And then what your options really are once you get that final decision. And then the second question here is about sort of data and what are the percentages of appeals cases that come out one way or the other. We don't have the answer to that information. We have actually, CCLP has submitted a Colorado Open Records Act request and has received some data directly from the department on these appeals. And we're still sort of going through and analyzing that data. And we hope to get more information and hopefully share some of that in the future. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Carrie said in the comments, just she appreciated that previous one for clarifying about the PAR component as well in terms of that terminology. All right. Well, I think we got through our whole list of questions here, unless somebody has one they want to post just here at the last moment or hop on audio. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up for today, but I think Katie and Milena have shared their contact information here, so definitely keep thinking of additional questions and get in touch with our team at CCLP here for more excellent information. And so with that, I think we're going to conclude this webinar, but we really want to thank all of you for attending today and participating with us and for so many excellent questions and for your engagement. We really, really appreciate it. And we're happy to be with you and be able to offer this webinar today. And we hope to be with you again for another informative event. So stay tuned to our newsletter, social media channels, and our website for more upcoming content. And we will connect with you again soon. So until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you.